There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains graphic depictions of violence against children and pedophilia. Listener discretion is advised.
It's a Wednesday morning in March 1996, and the bell sounds at Dunblane Primary School near Stirling in Scotland. Students scramble to their classrooms. Their minds are caught up in homework and friendships and the game they were just playing in the yard. A class of 28 Primary 1 pupils, aged between 4 and 6, congregate in the gymnasium, preparing for their morning PE lesson. In a nearby classroom sits an 8-year-old boy whose name is Andy. He has blue eyes and sandy-coloured hair and loves nothing more than tennis. On the weekends, he plays adults. Sometimes he even beats them. Today, he is known as Andy Murray, one of the greatest tennis players to have ever lived. It's just after 9:30 a.m. when 8-year-old Andy hears something. 2 gunshots just outside his classroom. They sound like they're coming from the gymnasium. The man holding the gun has on him 743 cartridges of ammunition. He's already cut cables at the bottom of a telegraph pole at the school's entrance, and he's about to execute the deadliest mass shooting in British history.
The scene here is one of utter confusion and fear. As news of the killing spread through the town, shocked parents ran to the primary school to find out whether their children were among the dead.
25 years later, the question remains, why? Who was this man, armed with more weapons than anyone could ever need, marching into a local primary school?
A former scout leader with a grudge walked into their primary school gymnasium with 4 handguns and, without warning, opened fire.
And is there a world in which this massacre could have been prevented? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with investigative criminologist Christopher Berry-D about his book, A Special Place in Hell, which details the cases of some of the world's most depraved serial killers, including Thomas Hamilton, the man behind the Dunblane Massacre. It was just after 9:30 a.m. on March the 13th, 1996, when a gunshot was heard inside Dunblane Primary School. What happened next? How did that morning unfold?
What we had was 13 pupils and 1 teacher were shot dead. 15 were wounded or injured. The perpetrator, Thomas Hamilton, he was 43 years old at the time, and then he shot himself. Andy Murray, the tennis player, was a pupil at the school at the time. He's still slightly traumatised by it today, the events.
You know, at the time, you have no idea how tough something like that is. But yeah, then as you start to get older, you realise, the thing that is nice now, the whole town, they recovered from it so well. And, it wasn't until, a few years ago that I started to actually, research it and look into it a lot because I didn't really want to know.
That's tennis star Andy Murray speaking about the incident. In your professional opinion, Christopher, how would you classify that killing at Dunblane?
This was what we call a mass murderer, a one-off killing, totally different to a serial killer where there's always a cooling off period in between the events, or a pre or rampage killer who goes on a rampage. This was all done at one location, so it was a mass killing.
And what do we know about Thomas Hamilton?
Thomas Hamilton is not difficult to understand. There's a lot of sort of retro research going into why he did what he did and what sort of personality he was. But when you actually drill down into his psychopathology, he's quite easy to understand. He's not a difficult subject to get your head around.
How did people describe him? So neighbours, did he have any friends? Like, how did people describe him?
Well, like a lot of these people, he was an introvert. I think, as far as I can remember, that the only real friend he had was an elderly lady, a neighbour. The other people he probably thought were his friends were some of the people that supported his Boy Scouts groups or came into his business. But he was a loner, and loners like that fantasise a lot. And as we know, he was a paedophile. There's no doubt about that either. He won't come out of his grave now to sue us because he's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But he was a paedophile. And actually, when you look at him, he's got a striking resemblance to John Reginald Christie, the famous 10 Rillington Place killer with his beady eyes and his little glasses. Very insignificant little, horrible, oily little man. But his back history is interesting. And if you sort of imagine, as I've done in the book, that if you walk past his home and if one dared look through his front window, which was easy to see, you'll see half-naked pictures of boys all over his front room. And what does that tell you about somebody like that? He's obviously not married. He's obviously living on his own. He's a fantasist. And eventually he believed in his own twisted mind that the world was against him. He denied everything. And then he lost the plot.
Was he ever convicted of pedophilia?
No. There were so many complaints. It started off when he was in the Scouts, as I recall, and there were constant complaints from boys' mothers saying that he was touching them inappropriately or cuddling up to them in his van. And he denied it all. He kept on, and then he got banned from one Scout group, and then he tried to inveigle his way into another one, and he got stopped for that. He wanted to be in contact with little boys all the time. And it would have only been a matter of time before the police were onto him, but to get the evidence, to substantiate a court hearing it wasn't easy for them. And I think at the end he knew that sooner or later the police would be knocking on his door yet again, and this time he'd probably go away in handcuffs. That's what blew his fuse.
And he had a bit of a reputation for complaining and for being paranoid. What sort of things did he do, especially in those last few years? What did neighbours remember of him sort of complaining in the community?
Well, I can't use the language I want to use because it starts with F's and it ends with G's and things. But he's a bombastic little man. I mean, a bit like some of these traffic wardens that waddle around at Christmas, a bit power crazy, a little bit of a control freak. He would complain at anybody. He had this thing about going to the local council. He wrote to the Queen, he wrote to MPs, whinging and whining to say he was persecuted. He was a public nuisance, really. And when some of these people actually did support him, this supported his ego. But underneath this is a very weak person with a very low self-esteem. And you've got the two fighting. You've got one part of him like Jekyll and Hyde that's saying, well, I'm right. I know I'm right. These people are a damn nuisance. I'm going to write to the Queen and complain to her that she'll understand. That sort of attitude. But the other part of him knows that it's wrong. He's wrong. And so there's two parts of him fighting. It's like a boxer fighting himself in the ring, And
it's also an enormous ego, I suppose, to think that the Queen would care about your complaints. You say that he was a narcissist. Why do you think that? What sort of traits did he exhibit that suggested he's a narcissist?
Well, one of the things that I do think a lot about, one of my dear friends is the former Miss World, Anne Sidney, and she does a lot of stuff on narcissism on the internet. And this narcissism thing particularly affects women more than anything because you've got these men who are control freaks. They've got very low self-esteem, but they're bullies and they suck people dry. They're in it for themselves. They're never in the wrong. And Hamilton fits that mould perfectly. To him, he was perfectly normal. He was in the right. And I will write to the Queen and I will demand the MP does something about it. He doesn't care about other people's feelings. He's the centre of his own little perverse world. So he's living in this self-denial thing all the time. Like I said, there's two personalities. You've got this sort of beady-eyed little horrible oily man wandering around the streets, giving a passing nod, a bit like John Christie would, I'm the man about town. Look at me with my anorak on and a stupid tie. And giving a nod to people. But people that knew him and met him said he was quite standoffish.
And you write as well that some children described him as Mr. Creepy. That was the name he got, and that he was quite chilling. Do you know what instances took place between him and those children that made them feel really uncomfortable?
Well, no, because a lot of this material is now withheld for 100 years, and I can understand why. There has been some of it released, but it is very sensitive stuff, more so because of the names of the victims and their families. I mean, it's just a terrible thing that he done. And then, obviously, any complaints made by children to their mums about Mr. Oily and his beady eyes and him touching, that's not the sort of thing that can go into the public domain anyway. But there was a lot of it because those parents then complained to the police and to the authorities who did do some work on it and research. So he had a black mark on him. But one thing I want to point out about this is his use of the 4 firearms. He had 2 9mm handguns and he had 2 357 revolvers, Dirty Harry styles. Now, we watch television and we watch the movies and we see Clint Eastwood fire one of these 357s through a Mack truck engine and blowing it up. Well, when I was researching this book, I decided to go online and look at some of these American rednecks who work at mum and dad's shoe shop, and then every weekend they pile into a back of pickup trucks, loaded up with these guns. And there was this one guy, and he said, I'm taking my 357 down to the range and firing it a steel plate 100 yards away. What an asshole. And he fired this bullet, went straight through this steel plate up 100 yards, 50, 60 yards away, blew a hole through it.
Wow. This
is what Thomas Hamilton's guns did to little kiddies at point blank range. Some of the kids were actually on the floor, injured anyway, so he gave them the coup de grace, blew their heads off.
How did he get access to those guns?
Well, at the time, Britain being Britain, a lot of other countries as well, I just think we're just as bad. We were just as bad. You could, if you had a license and you had a more or less a reasonable record, you could purchase almost anything. Look, you've got Michael Ryan, the Hungerford Massacre, had Kalashnikovs and all sorts of stuff. But what I will say, and I think it's your country as well, it might be New Zealand, I'm not 100%, but I know that after Dunblane, we literally banned these weapons.
We had a similar incident in Australia in Port Arthur, and our Prime Minister made the same call, and we haven't had a massacre of that size anywhere near that since. And you see what's happening in the United States and you just think it's so obvious.
In America, you can buy these things like sweets. These people, mums are going to school, teachers are going to school armed. The difference between the UK and Australia and New Zealand and any half-sensible country is that our children can go to school and the dinner lady's not wearing a revolver. The guy on the gate who doffs his cap and knows all the kids by name is not dressed like somebody from a SWAT thing. We can go to church on a Sunday and not have to be strip searched and put through a metal detector to see if we've got concealed weapons on us. And if we have, we've got to leave them with the lady at the front desk at reception. I mean, these Americans have become a totally neurotic. They call themselves the land of the free. But how can you be free if everywhere you've got to go, you've got to carry a gun?
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Christopher Berry D, the author of A Special Place in Hell. You've looked at serial killers and now at mass murders. Do you think there's a different profile? Someone walks into a school with these sorts of weapons and takes this many lives in about 10 minutes. What is the motive? What brings someone to commit a crime of that magnitude?
Well, serial killers, especially male, are basically sexually motivated. They actually hate women with a passion. That's why they call, like Ted Bundy's and people like that, they cause so much pain and suffering to women and torturing them. They don't say they love them, they hate them really deep down. So they're sexually motivated. Some women serial killers that I've met, they suffocate old ladies in a nursing home, or you've got Aileen Wuornos, that I did the movie Monster with my book on Lee. She was an interstate hooker. She was bisexual. She had a girlfriend called Taria Moore. She went out on the highways and the byways. 200 guys had gone with her. And a lot of these guys were going to go to court, and they went to the police and said, look, with Lee, all you had to do was give her the money and she was as good as gold. 6 or 7 guys beat her up, tried to knock her about, and she shot them. Now, a mass murderer is a completely different kettle of fish. He's grudge-driven. He could be a religious fanatic. I've done quite a lot of work with one of your older terrorists, your ASIO organisation. I did some stuff with them on Jack Roche, who was in with Al-Qaeda. I've got all his encrypted files here. He was a religious fanatic. So people like Michael Ryan, Thomas Hamilton, you might have a guy walk into a McDonald's or somewhere like that and shoot the staff up. He's probably a disgruntled employee that got the sack. You've got airline employees who get fired for petty thieving, then they get on a flight and then they put a gun to the pilot's head and bring the plane down with everybody on it out of grudge. Not sexually motivated at all. Mass murderers are not sexually motivated in the serial killer sense.
Do you think Thomas Hamilton that day intended to take his own life? That was always part of the plan?
Well, if you look at the school shootings in America, many of the school shootings, Sandy Hook and things like that, they're on this sort of suicide by cop mission almost. They're going to go in, they're not going to come out. Occasionally they'll put their hands up and, oops a daisy, I shouldn't have done that. And then they'll get given the lethal injection in a federal facility. Good riddance to them. But Hamilton was on a suicide mission. And for him to get involved in a gunfight with the cops, his bottle dropped and he just took the gun. He was finished then. He knew he'd come to the end of the road and he probably looked round and saw what he'd done, and that was it. He just blew his brains out.
Yeah. Do you think that this crime and crimes like this could have been prevented? Obviously, the weapons is a big factor, but do you think that someone like Thomas Hamilton would have perpetrated this sort of damage in some other way if he didn't have access to those weapons?
Well, here's the thing. I want to just go back to the American Constitution. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, the right to bear arms, in those days, all they had was a flintlock pistol or a musket, and it takes 30 seconds to load or more. They had no idea then that there would be guns that were firing 1,000 rounds a minute. So the Americans have misused it. They've abused their own constitution, which they do all the time, like Mr. Trump does every 5 minutes. But really, if there's no guns, then Hamilton, if he'd have just gone in there with a knife, he would have been overpowered in moments. But they were helpless. I mean, it was a massacre. If he had not had access to those sort of weapons, that massacre could not have occurred. He might have stabbed a few people. He might have thrown some petrol into the building. But, we're only talking 20 minutes, 10 minutes. So it's the access to firearms. Look, if you put the gun on a table and you put the person that owns it at the other end of the table and he can't touch it, that gun won't go off. It's as simple as that. Take the gun away, he's got no chance of touching it.
What do you think that school represented to him? Do you think it was something to do with the pedophilia in his past? Like, what was the school that was such a source of anger for him?
Well, we can't really know what was going on inside his head, but let's just say he must have had a grudge against kids complaining. You know, he's got to vent his anger in certain ways. And over so many years, he'd had the police knocking on his door. He's had people closing his business down, putting him off his business, making complaints, which he would see, being a narcissist, as they're bullying him. And so his anger is then directed at children. You know, the same as the guy who gets sacked from the airline. He gets on a freebie flight and he's got this grudge. He's lost his home, he's lost his job, he blames the airline, and then he decides to bring a plane down.
So this was in 1996, and as you say, there were some policies, there was some reform in the wake of this in terms of weapons and firearms in the UK. Has there been any shooting of this scale in Scotland or in England since?
We've had one guy called Derek Bird who had not a very high-powered weapon, a taxi driver, who went on a rampage, killing anybody that got in his way, and then he was shot dead by police. But his weapons, I think, were a shotgun and a small caliber rifle. I can't be exactly precise, mostly point blank. That's a one-off, but the weapons he had post Dunblane were legally held. One was a long gun, they call it, and the other one was a shotgun. And he lived in quite a rural area. You know, that's fine. You know, farmers have got to have guns and people got them for pest control and skeet shooting. I get that. That's not a problem. But why do these people need to buy automatic military quality weapons? They're wannabe soldiers. I mean, I served in the special forces, you know, and you look at these Americans dressed up in these stupid SWAT outfits with these big mag-like torches hanging around their waists. They work in a gas station or they work for their mum and pop candy shop. Overweight, gross rednecks, they think they want to be right-wing soldiers.
It's almost like trying to replicate a video game or something. Like, it's not real life.
Yeah. You don't get a really sensible businessman out there or a woman that's got a really good professional business going down the woods at weekends and blowing holes in trees. They've got better things to do. You'll find that these men and women that do that have got very low self-esteem. And what they do is they exercise their so-called power by holding a gun. It's almost like a phallus symbol.
It's about power. Finally, on that, I wanted to ask, with all the work you've done on serial killers, what do you think the world's most depraved serial killers have in common? What's the common thread or threads that you've identified in your work?
I think the sadomsexual side of it is what disturbs me, is the torturing before the actual kill. What they put the victim through. Peter Curtin's one of them, German between the wars. We don't know what Ted Bundy did to his victims, which makes it even more horrifying. You know, I've done work with David Alan Gore, he's now executed, hung his young girls up in a barn, stripped them, flayed them alive, burned them, tortured them, cut their breasts off and then killed them. I mean, that sadomsexual homicide is bad. And a lot of these killers don't use guns. They like to cut and strangle and torture and throttle and then take their hands off. These sadomosexual killers are beasts, horrible.
And does it look to you like, with this case specifically, with Thomas Hamilton, with mass murder, is it possible that he just snapped, or do you think he lived as a narcissistic psychopath and this was consistent with his personality?
Right, well, I've got a very simple analogy for you guys in Australia on this one, and I love it myself, and I just love it doing this in my books. Imagine you've got a steam boiler, and underneath you've got some water in it, and underneath you've got a flame, and you heat it up, like on a ship, a steam boiler. And the pressure builds up, and the valve gets stuck, and there's no release. And if you think of Hamilton, here he is, he's trying to find relief. He's complaining to people, he's writing letters, but nobody's taking notes, and this pressure builds up and up and up and up and up, and it's all of a sudden, boom, and it goes off. That's exactly what happens to the human brain. You see very milder examples with road rage, where people get so wound up in their cars that they start screaming and banging the dashboard, and then they give the finger to somebody else, and all of a sudden the road's clear and it all goes away. And they think, oh, well, that was all right, forget it. It's that rage build up, and then there is no escape, and then the mind blows.
And then give them access to a weapon, and that's just a perfect storm.
That's it. Yeah, you couldn't have prevented it. The only way to have prevented it was not to have had the guns in the first place, and that is simple.
Christopher Berry-Dee is a world-renowned investigative criminologist who's interviewed more than 30 of the most dangerous male and female serial killers of contemporary times. His book, A Special Place in Hell, details 10 of what he considers to be the most depraved serial killers he's ever worked on. You'll find a link to that book in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to discuss today's episode with other true crime fans, search True Crime Conversations on Facebook and join our online community. And if you don't want to miss a single episode, make sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts.